All right, there we go. Hello, so welcome everyone to this virtual OWOW stakeholder meeting that we will be covering Proposition 1, Integrated Regional Water Management Round 2 grant funding for the Santa Ana River Watershed. My name is Ian Ackmore. I'm a Senior Watershed Manager at the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, or SAPA. So we'll be covering a number of things in the meeting today. These 6 items were sent out to our contact list that we keep. So hopefully you got an email with the 6 items here that we'll be covering. If you didn't, there's ways to register to receive emails about this program, One Watershed program, and this funding that we're talking about today. I will be covering available grant funding for Prop 1 Round 2 IRWM and the schedule to roll out that funding through what we call the OWOW Call for projects. Possible updates to the Round 2 ranking criteria that would be scored to use to score Round 2 project proposals. Summary of the feedback we've received so far from past workshops, the OWOW Steering Committee regarding Round 2 ranking criteria, an in-depth background of the state's disadvantaged community criteria and GIS mapping tool, highlights of other upcoming grant programs to be managed by the Department of Water Resources, and very importantly, input from stakeholders like you, like I mentioned earlier. I will pause periodically for questions and feedback. We want this to be a conversation and not just a PowerPoint presentation. So first, I'll be doing a background on key points covered in today's workshop. I wanted to give everyone a background just in case this is your first OWOW workshop. So like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about an integrated regional water management grant opportunity through the OWOW program. It's important to back up and describe what is this statewide program. It is a planning program and a grant opportunity. The grant funding for this program is allocated across the state through a water bond, Proposition 1, that was passed in 2014 by the California electorate. The money is allocated across what are called funding areas. That's the term used in the Proposition 1 water bond. There are 12 funding areas that you can see on the right here. We are in the orange one, funding area 5, known as the Santa Ana funding area. Santa Ana funding area is also called Santa Ana River Watershed or Santa Ana River Watershed IRWM region. There are 48 sub areas within these 12 funding areas, but for our funding area, we're lucky enough to just have one region in one funding area. So there's not, multiple regions within this process. It's also important to note, SAPA manages this IRWM program, also known as the One Water, One Watershed program. But we don't just do things in a vacuum. We have our governing body approve the action that we do before we move forward. So such as the grant application that we're talking about today, that still needs to go to our OWOW Steering Committee and SAPA Commission, which some of the callers on this webinar are a part of. So we are in the Santa Ana funding area, aka the Santa Ana River Watershed or Santa Ana IRWM region, and this is just locally what it looks like. We're next to a couple other funding areas, including Los Angeles and San Diego. And this is a higher resolution map or more focused map. The Santa Ana funding area includes northern Orange County. It includes the Inland Empire up into the San Bernardino Mountains and falls pretty much along the ridgeline of the San Bernardino Mountains, so which makes it really watershed based. But it does fall along the county line here. So LA County is, a different funding area, but this is San Bernardino County. It's divided along that county line. It extends down the Lake Elsinore and up to the ridge line in Mount San Jacinto, thus covering also this San Jacinto River watershed, which eventually drains into the Santa Ana River here. So it's pretty much hydrologically driven, but it's also got some politically drawn boundaries, which include the counties. So the funding that's designated for this funding area comes out to a total of $50 million. That's the grand total, and this funding has been rolled out for Proposition 1 in 2 rounds. Round 1 already happened. It happened in 2018, part of 2019, and round 2, which is kicking off here, includes 2 pots of money from the state, general implementation money, and then disadvantaged community implementation money, or DAC implementation money. So those 2 pots are 22.9 million, and then about 4.1 million. So a total of 27 million. And we at SAPA executed agreement with North Orange County IRWM group in 2019. This agreement allocated funding across the Santa Ana funding area, partially geographically. So some of that general implementation money was broken up, or all that general implementation money that I showed was broken up to 3 categories that you can see in this pie chart here. So it still totals to that I showed on the bar chart, but it's broken up into geographic areas. A large portion is for the upper watershed, which is San Bernardino and Riverside County in our funding area. And then there is a Northern Orange County pot of money that's, for Orange County. And then the last pot is watershed-wide funding. So that includes a project that benefits Northern Orange County, Riverside, and San Bernardino County. And we'll talk about this more in the presentation, but it's important to note that there's also a slice of the pie that wasn't broken out geographically. That's what remains unchanged from the bar chart on the previous slide. That's DAC implementation. And then there's a piece that SAPA uses for managing this overall process. And eventually when we get into the grant application and implementing the grant project, over about 5 years, we use a portion of this funding that's in the bar chart for grant administration. Here's a high-level draft round 2 schedule, and this is important to note because we'll be kind of coming back to this throughout this presentation here. We are in the process right about here. We do have our governing body approved a policy for Proposition 1 funding after it came out back in November 2018, but we're kind of in a waiting period here now. We're waiting for state guidelines to come out on round 2. We do have guidelines that we've analyzed from round 1, and that's what has really helped us craft this workshop content today. But we're still waiting for those guidelines to come out as draft from the state. Once they do, we can finalize our scoring criteria that I'll get into. We'll have our application period called the OWOW Call for Projects. DWR will finalize their grant guidelines. We'll then go through what I describe as a staff review and participatory budgeting project of the projects that were submitted through this call for projects. Our governing body will approve those projects, and then we'll submit those projects in a formal application to the state Department of Water Resources because they manage the overall state IRWM program. DWR will review our application, then announce an award, and then we'll later execute an agreement with DWR as well as the successful project proponents. So if you are planning out and thinking about if your project is successful, this is kind of the date we're working to at the end. And then the timeline, I guess another part of the schedule is when your project would have to be completed. And we're estimating that would be 5 years after execution of this agreement. So April 2029, which seems a very long way off. That first part of the schedule was the policy, right? That was approved by our governance. What's in that? It has high-level policy language that states what a project proponent or applicant must demonstrate about their project. It will be completed with active participation of multiple agencies or NGOs or other stakeholders, produces a net benefit to the watershed and has no unreasonable negative impacts on others, and is a sustainable and resilient to changing conditions in the watershed. Also as background, since we're in the background section now, I thought it'd also be important to highlight, what is a disadvantaged community? As you'll know if you participate in these other workshops, this comes up a lot. So there are 2 important disadvantaged community definitions from Prop 1 and from the state. One is, of course, disadvantaged community or DAC. And we have the definition that's important to this group because it's from Prop 1. So a disadvantaged community means a community with an annual median household income that is less than 80% of the statewide annual median household income. So it's important to note that's very income driven. It's less than a median amount for the state. So, it's less than what is considered almost average for the state. But then there's another definition that has come out through Proposition 1 and from the state. That's economically distressed area, or EDA. And the state DWR defines this as an attempt to capture disadvantaged communities that have a state median household income that's slightly not as low. So between 80 and 85% of the statewide annual median household income. While the EDA definition is similar to the DAC definition in utilizing state MHI, or median household income, as a determining factor, the EDA definition also includes other factors such as financial hardship, unemployment, and population density. So these definitions are important to keep in the back of your mind when we're talking about the DAC funding. As we've talked in the past, through Proposition 1, there is a local cost share requirement. Through Prop 1, you're required to provide 50% local cost share. So if your total project costs for your project are $100, you would be required to provide $50 from local or even federal sources. Federal sources are okay, it just can't be other state sources. And in-kind services may also be used for cost share, such as staff time. But there is a way to get your cost share waiver reduced. And that comes back to if your project benefits a DAC or EDA area. And remember, those DAC and EDA areas are primarily defined by income level. And that's where income surveys come into play. And we'll get into this more, but income surveys, there's a lot of existing data out there that DWR houses, and it's data from the US Census Bureau. So this table on the right shows how a project can waive or even reduce all of their cost share requirement. And it's based on thresholds, and this is from Prop 1 Round 2's grant guidelines, which is the PSP, or Proposal Solicitation Package. And if your project benefit area or project construction area provides, 75 to 100% of your area is DAC or EDA, you can totally waive your cost share. But then looking at the other end of the spectrum, if your project benefit area or project construction area benefits, just less than 25% DAC or EDA, then your cost share, it doesn't really matter in the eyes of the state. Your cost share would still stay at 50%. So these thresholds are important when thinking about cost share requirement. But in thinking about benefits to disadvantaged community, we've talked about DAC and EDA and how they're income based. It's also important to think about how that works in practice. And that's where this language from Proposition 1 of direct DAC benefit comes into play. So DWR and their legal counsel thought really hard about what direct means. And from their guidance, direct means benefits need to accrue to those parcels where DAC community members work/live. So to articulate that, we've got a couple of bullets here. So projects that create water supply, protect property from flood control are okay. Those protect community members where they work/live. Projects that protect water quality on parcels, okay, such as septic to sewer. Other projects that improve infrastructure related to supply or quality, it's a bit broader, that's still okay. But projects that protect habitat and quality of recreational water bodies, maybe a water body lake that's not used for drinking water, are not competitive because the general public enjoys them. Thus, they are indirect DAC benefits. So what I picture in my mind is a house with a meter and just the benefits being direct, you're clearly able to articulate them. They can be a bit more fuzzy than having a meter. But something that's very indirect, like a service water body that's used just recreationally, that wouldn't be direct enough. So how do we connect the two, this direct benefit and the median household income? Well, here's some guidance from DWR. To do that, you need to count the DAC areas within either a construction footprint area or the larger benefit area. So benefit area can be your entire service area if it's all getting supplied by maybe a well that you're putting in. Construction footprint area would just be where you are digging dirt, maybe the fenced off area of your project. And you use income data to determine this. And you can use survey data of your own if no data exists for a given area. The purpose really, right, of looking at income surveys data is to determine if you're eligible for a waiver of that cost share requirement in that threshold table that I showed, or if you're eligible receiving some or maybe all of that purple slice of the pie, that 4.1 million in DAC implementation grant funding. DWR states that they'll provide further guidance and detail for DAC, DAC and EDA. They acknowledge that their round one PSP and guidelines weren't as detailed as they could have been. So more information about DAC and EDA will come out, and we'll provide it through our OWOW process. And here's, I alluded to this, DWR has a tool to map DACs for your project. What it does is it displays in a GIS web-based tool data from the US Census Bureau. And it allows you to upload your own project benefit area through this add data button here on the left that I show. So if you have your service area or your project benefit area or your construction footprint in a shapefile, you can upload that and then see where these disadvantaged communities are based on data from US Census Bureau. The 2020 US Census data will be also posted to this tool. It isn't up there yet, but we hear from DWR it'll be posted in the coming months. I will pause there before we move on. I covered a lot just getting started, about the funding, the schedule, and disadvantaged community EDA. So I'll pause here and see if the group has any questions before I move on. I don't see anything in the chat box at the moment, but I'll give it another minute. All right, let's move on. All right, so next, here are some examples of projects that would be eligible for the general implementation category. It's important to note, as I state on the bottom of this slide, that the OWOW process for round 2 may include a separate funding allocation and competition pool for disadvantaged communities, single benefit, and single jurisdictional projects, and we'll get more into this. So if you are competing for the general implementation pot of funding, which is that upper watershed and watershed-wide funding, it's important to note that we're looking for projects that reflect the tenets of integrated regional water management. So what does that mean? What do those 4 words mean? The 2 key words are the first word, integrated. That means a project with multiple benefits. And the second word is regional, and that means multiple partners are covering a large area. So the first element of that is multi-benefit, right? And what do we mean by multi-benefit? We mean a water resources related project, right? So that's something like groundwater, habitat, or stormwater. So for example, a groundwater multi-benefit project could be a project that removes contaminants from a basin, maybe it has treatment attached to it. So that's one benefit that you're counting numerically, maybe in milligrams per liter, or maybe MGD, million gallons per day. And then the other benefit is you are probably providing a new potable supply of water to your service area, a portion of your service area. So that would be measured in acre feet, and that's another benefit. The list goes on for habitat. One there can be you're providing a new reclaimed water conveyed to a dry stream for fish and downstream use, maybe by another downstream water agency. And you're also, by watering a dry stream bed, you're also providing a place where plants can grow and tree habitat that'll benefit stuff like birds. The other is a stormwater project that maybe you are building some type of retention basin. You're not only capturing new water, but you're also possibly protecting an area from flooding. So that would be an acre foot benefit, a water supply benefit, and an area protection benefit that could be measured in acres. It's also important to note that we're not looking for projects because the state's not looking for these types of projects. That can be an operational activity. This must be a new project. And here's the second element. So multi-benefit, multi-partner or regional project. That's where the word regional comes from in integrated regional water management. OWOW encourages projects that cover large areas of the funding area, i.e. Santa Ana River watersheds. Partners can provide resources such as funding, staff time, land, that sort of thing. The key word that they provide is it's a critical activity. A partner can't just be an entity that wrote a letter of support. So lastly, here's the feedback to date. We've presented this type of information in the past over the course of about 4 workshops and 3 OWOW Steering Committee meetings this year. And the kind of feedback we've gotten is that SAPA should perform outreach to possible grant applicants, which we've done. We've performed outreach to various different types of stakeholder groups. We have recently, we're going to have a tribal workshop next week. Another feedback we got was to enlarge in the inland water body benefit area, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. We had strong support for the water resources related weight remaining as a high weight, and we'll get into that later too. And then we also had questions about the DAC cost share waiver, which we just talked about. All right, we'll now talk about draft ranking process updates to round 2. But before I do, I see we have a chat. At the end, could you repost the schedule? It was on too quickly for me to write down their important information. Yes, I will do that. Not a problem. Any other questions before we move on? I'm going to cover, really dive into the ranking process and possible updates for round 2. But any other questions before I move on? Hearing none, I'll move on to the possible updates for ranking. So we're now going to be talking about a part of the process that occurs after applications are submitted to OWOW. The OWOW call for projects happens. We ask, for information about your project, including your numeric benefits. And then we use your numeric benefits to score your projects and produce a ranked list. So we're going to be talking about how we do that scoring. And to kick that off, I thought I'd show what we did under Proposition 1, Round 1 through the OWOW ranking process. We use this formula here on the bottom, and it takes numeric benefits from your project from 12 different categories that you can see on the right. And what we do is we take the benefits from your project, such as acres, and we divide it by the denominator here is the highest amount of acres in that particular benefit category. So there's 12 benefit categories. So each benefit category goes through this fraction right here. So if you're the highest valued acre project in your particular category, you would get the full amount of this multiplication formula right here. You would get a 20. You get 20 points. But that's not the only multiplication that goes on. Your share of this 20 points then gets multiplied by a weighting factor, and the weighting factors are here. So it really depends how your project squares up against other projects in a particular category, and then how big this weighting factor is in that category you provided numeric benefits. It's also important to note that there are 2 competition pools that we ran this formula for. So your projects weren't just scored against all projects. You had the option to go into one pool of projects or another pool of projects. The first pool was large projects. The second pool was small projects. And we defined a large and small project based on if you applied for 500K in grant funding or less. So a small project would be, a project that applied for 500K or less. Large project would be 500K or more. It's also important to note that those were the 2 main overarching umbrella competition pools. So disadvantaged community and general implementation projects, they competed together. I mean, they checked a box and told us they were interested in disadvantaged community funding, but they didn't compete just in their own competition pool. And also upper watershed and watershed-wide projects competed together. They weren't segmented into 2 different pools. They all competed together, and we segmented the funding and allocated the successful projects on the back end, as I'll go into later. So they were all, these types of projects, DAC, general implementation, upper watershed, and watershed wide, were all awarded funding based on the high score projects in their pool and this funding formula that we used. So here's the two competition pools that we used under round one. So you have to choose one or the other. You can't compete in both. So for round two, we're switching it up. We're recommending, we think this will work well going forward, that we use DAC or general implementation as our two competition pools. And I'll explain how that'll work going forward. But this is draft for now. We haven't presented it to our OWOW Steering Committee or SOPA Commission. So we will, we're seeking your input today, and we'll later go to our governing bodies with your input and our recommendation. And here's the money attached. If we decide the governing body is supportive, this is the money that would be attached to these two competition pools. DAC would get what was in the pie chart, 4.1 million. General implementation would get what was in the pie chart, 4.4 million. So no changes really from what the state gave us. This is how the state allocated the money to this region, and we're using these as our two competition pools. Under general implementation, per the pie chart and per the agreement that we have with North Orange County's IRWM group, there is funding designated under general implementation for upper watershed and watershed wide funding. And that funding is spoken to in that agreement. The agreement with North Orange County allocates that formula based on some percentages. So by using those percentages, that's how we get these numbers. And so those numbers are locked into stone per that agreement. So, and lastly, those upper watershed, watershed wide, again, those aren't competition pools. The competition pools are DAC, general implementation. Those are the two forks in the road. So funding gets distributed between these two, not competition pools, but maybe pots of money after projects are submitted and highest scoring projects are determined through a formula. And here's our draft recommendation for ranking updates. So in this slide, I am just showing how many different benefit classes we had, what they covered. They covered a lot of different categories and their weighting factors. For round two, you can see we're reducing the benefit categories for general implementation down to 6. That's what we're recommending as of now. And then for DAC, we're recommending going down to 3 benefit categories. But then we're adding on something new and different. We know that we're reducing the amount of categories. So we've added this extra component that'll go into where a project can get extra credit and you'll see it's based on percentages for 3 different criteria that their project can meet. A DAC does not have any extra percentages, as I'll get into. So general implementation competition competition pool. I talked about that we had 6 categories and 3 different extra percentages, and here they are laid out. We have water supply, water quality improvement, stormwater protection, habitat improvement, percentage of your DAC EDA area, climate change adaptation mitigation. And then as the extra percentages benefits, we have a benefit for tribal benefit. You'll get an extra 10% of your score using these categories. If you're a lead applicant that is a federally recognized Indian tribe, or California State Indian tribe listed on the Native American Heritage Commission's California Tribal Consultation list, then you'll get extra 15% of the scoring formula that'll show. If you have an amount of the IRWM funding area, or if you have a large area, or if your project benefits a large area of the IRWM funding area or adjacent IRWM regions that fall within the project benefit area. And then lastly, an extra 5% if your project employs a new or innovative technology or practice, and that really comes from a state priority there. So a lot going on in this slide. I'll come back later to this again a couple of times because we know this is a change. There's a lot going on in this slide. You've got 6 categories as opposed to 12. We've condensed them. And what we've tried to do, and you may be wondering how the two compare, round one's categories compare to this 6 categories and how their weights compare. I'll show that later too. But I will add that we tried, or we did average the category weights from round one. We also rounded them to the nearest whole number. You know, the numbers were coming out to 9.2, 6.4. And just to make it as simple as possible and signal the weight and importance to the watershed for these weights, you know, we're providing them as whole numbers. So we rounded them to the nearest whole number. We also, in our analysis of round one, we saw that there was a lot of projects submitting the same benefits, like the same acre feet, because it was the same numeric value for different categories. So it wasn't tracking really the multi-benefits that the state and OWOW were looking for. You know, like I showed, the multiplied benefits we're looking for and come from that previous slide. You know, it can be for a floodwater, stormwater project. It can be for a water supply provided and acres protected. And so you still see that captured here in 2 different categories. In the previous round, we had multiple categories that sort of got at the same thing, and you saw project proponents submitting the same value, the same water molecules for both. I'll pause there. I've got more to cover on this, but I'll pause here and see if anybody has any questions on this, as this is a lot of information to take in. All right, no questions. I will move on. I don't see anything in the chat box. I'll move on. So we talked about the general implementation competition pool and how it's changed from 12 weighted categories and extra percentages to 6. Here is the DAC competition pool. You'll see that it just has 3 categories and no extra percentage, extra credit categories. It has water supply, water quality improvement, stormwater management. It doesn't have climate change adaptation, mitigation, and doesn't have habitat. And it doesn't have those extra percentage categories. The reason why it doesn't have habitat or climate change adaptation is because we're looking for we're looking to fill that change that we are making from round one. We're looking for smaller projects. In a way, since we're getting rid of that smaller project category, we wanted project proponents to more easily be able to compete in this round. Evaluating how your project or providing multiple under this category, we're likely going to just score projects if they provide one benefit. So you'll only have to apply water supply. You don't have to provide water supply or water quality. So it didn't really make sense to include climate change adaptation mitigation, as we're very likely not going to get a water resource project that is only going to provide climate change adaptation as their one benefit. We're also not including habitat, as I mentioned, as from DWR's criteria and guidelines, they are not allowing projects that have an indirect benefit to disadvantaged communities. They're still looking for habitat related projects, but not for direct benefit to disadvantaged communities to get that 4.1 million. So we didn't think it would make sense to include habitat because that's primarily a project that would benefit an open space area that would be an indirect benefit to DACs. You know, the general public can enjoy them. So it talked about the different weights, categories, and here's a comparison of the different formulas and how they would work. So we had 2 multipliers going on, but 12 categories in the first formula. In this formula, we have 6 categories. We still have the multiplier, same thing going on, your project's benefit in your category, both out of the highest value benefit in that one category, multiplied by some weighting factor. Those weighting factors are something that are draft right now, but they'll be finalized based on your input and our governing body's input. I took out the 20 too, because the 20 just served a purpose is, I think, of just making the numbers bigger. So I simplified it by removing that. If everything's getting multiplied by the same numeric value, it's not really changing how you compare these scores to each other. Now, for the DAC competition pool, the formula is just contained within these blue brackets here, and you only have 3 categories. But for the general implementation pool, you have 6 categories, and then you have these extra credits. You have, if you check the box, if you're a yes or no, and we verified that, you get enlarged by 10% of what's calculated in this bracket. And then if regional, if new, innovative, the same thing. It doesn't compound, it doesn't grow. If you get 10%, the number doesn't grow in the brackets, and then you get 15% on top of that 10% compounding that's going on. It's individually 10%, 15%, 5% is multiplied by what's in the brackets here. At least that's how I laid out this formula for conversation purposes and for eventual recommendation. These 10%, 15%, 5% are open to feedback. This is what we proposed initially. We thought regional 15% represented kind of like the core tenet of IRWM. It's in the name. We thought tribal was a key component as well. That is definitely a priority of the state and something that's important in our IRWM plan. New and innovative ranked a little lower in our thinking because any project, it's easier for a project to kind of employ a new innovative technology in, say, a component of their project, like maybe a new metering technology or a new valve technology. So a lower bar for that, so that's why we gave it a lower weight. And this is the general implementation categories laid out in a more detailed table. I've got the percentage benefits listed on the bottom here. What I add into this table is text that describes them, as well as the units that they would provide. So for climate change adaptation mitigation, tons of CO2. If we go this route of using climate change adaptation mitigation, we'll research how applicants can easily convert parts of their project to tons of CO2, because a lot of project proponents aren't used to using a greenhouse gas reduction calculator. So we'll investigate that, and we imagine DWR will help out with that too. But starting at the top, water supply is pretty easy. Amount of water supply provided through innovation and optimization measured in acre feet. Water quality improvement, amount of water quality improved for people and environment. It can be a wastewater type benefit. Stormwater protection, amount of acres protected from flooding, measured in areas such as acres. Habitat improvement, sort of similar, also measured in area, amount of preserved or enhanced natural habitat. Another route you could do is stream miles, but we were hoping everyone would be okay with acres, so we can use a similar unit and compare apples to apples. Percentage of DAC in the area, you would use the DAC tool at the end of the day, the GIS tool to calculate and do some math. Look at your benefit area or construction area and count geographically or population wise what percentage of your population or geographic area within your benefit or construction area is DAC or EDA. So that's something you would do simple percentage calculation and ultimately give us a percentage, and we can help you with that if you need further assistance on using the DAC GIS mapping tool to do that, or if you need assistance in doing your own survey, if you want to use data besides the US Census Bureau. We talked about climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and then we talked about the 3 percentages. Those are yes or no, then you get the extra credit, but you'll need to provide documentation and reasoning for why your project meets that category. And for detailed DAC categories, they use 3 of those, and they use similar or the same weights, same type of category information. I just kind of simplified that third column, same units. So I will pause there again. That was a lot of information I just covered, but I will pause there and see if anybody has questions again, and I'll check the chat box. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. All right, don't see anything in the chat box, so I'll move on. All right, Next part of the process, we're going to be starting about the grant application process. So the focus of this is what happens after projects are ranked. It goes through something called participatory budgeting, which is an OWOW local process. So I'll be talking about this. So what is what happens after ranking? OWOW participatory budgeting process. So after the ranking, OWOW workshops go through what we call participatory budgeting before the OWOW governance approves the final suite of projects. And this process was used under round one. If you submitted a project, you'll be familiar with that from round one. Developed with the goals of transparency, objectivity, and deliberation. The purpose was to receive input on the projects proposed in the OWOW process. Are the projects eligible for OWOW Prop 1? Hopefully they are, but it's a question that we need to ask. Are the benefits claimed realistic? That's a key question because that can be subjective. We ask that each project proponent present their benefits claimed and what's science, what data, what's similar. Maybe they base their benefits claimed off a similar project with a similar scope and the benefits achieved from that project. We ask you to walk us through that. So it's important you be ready for that. Before you submit your project, you want to make sure your project is ready to defend itself in terms of benefits claim. Is the watershed improved without unreasonable expense detriment to others? So, we're going to be asking you, does your project take away maybe water source that another entity was relying on? And does it include active participation of multiple agencies if you're submitting funding for general implementation? That won't really be a question for DAC implementation if we go that route for under DAC implementation seeking a single benefit and single jurisdiction projects. And I mentioned this earlier, the importance of benefit areas. This is something that we'll talk about under the participatory budgeting process. The benefit area is also critical if you want to look at DAC funding or the DAC cost share waiver or removal. Your benefit areas, where your benefits trickle down to. It can be your service area, it can be a watershed, it can be a stream. It's probably different than your construction footprint, which is where you have your fenced off area where you're building something. For ecosystem projects, and we'll have guidance on this, we're looking for U.S. Geological Survey designated HUC 12s, that level of your benefit, if your benefits trickle downstream, and for you to reasonably defend the HUC 12s that you chose. For a surface water quality and groundwater quality project, we'll be asking for HUC 12s and DWR 118 groundwater basins. Those are kind of like the industry standard for groundwater basins from the California Department of Water Resources. For a coastal water quality recreation type project, we'll be asking if you have that type of project, how is your 10-mile, or how does if your project benefits that, we'll be looking at a 10-mile buffer area. And for inline parks or water body recreation oriented projects, recreation being being definitely a secondary benefit and not a primary benefit area. We're looking at 10-mile or 5-mile. We're still assessing that. We got feedback from our governing body that they would like the inland water body benefit areas to be on par with the 10-mile buffer areas we were using for round one for coasts. All right, so after participatory budgeting and we square up everyone's benefit areas, because those benefit areas are key, as you can see in some of the criteria. So if benefit area is changing through the participatory budgeting process, we'll rescore the projects, which we do Excel based. They take your benefits and multiply them by those weighting factors and those percentages. So after we do that formula and we redo it through the participatory budget process and get buy-in from everyone, and by everyone I mean the stakeholders, any stakeholders that are interested in attending, and then all the project proponents too. If you submit a project, you'll be required to attend these and present about your project. We won't, force you to provide feedback on other people's projects, but we'll continually ask questions and SAPA staff will weigh in. If we aren't able to reach consensus, our plan, our IRWM plan states that we will bring a staff recommendation to the governing bodies and they will make the final decision. But under round one, we reached near consensus through participatory budgeting. So with that, how do we award grant and how do we assign dollar values of grant to individual projects? And what we're proposing to do in round one is like like I talked about earlier, for how we rate projects through a formula, we're also recommending using a formula because that's objective, right? That's objective as we can make this process to calculate how much grant we award to projects. But before we do that, we use kind of a subjective process that we will also do through the participatory budgeting process. We look at the highest scored projects, and you can see 12 example projects here that was scored under round one. And the subjective process comes in where we look for a breaking point in the projects. Under round one, we got a clear breaking point. We not only just looked at numbers like project ID and their weight scores, we also talked about the nature of those projects. So that's where the subjective part of this first grant award recommendation comes in. We look at a breaking point, we talk about it with a group. And then once we determine those ranked highest projects, we then can calculate our formula. So we determined that these were our highest projects, and we had the amount of projects and their weighted score. So what we do next is we run a formula. This is what we did in round one and what we're recommending too. We take your weighted score of your project and divide it by the total weighted score of the other top projects. So if I can go back, not your share of all the weighted scores, but your share of these top weighted scores. So project one obviously has the highest weighted score, and it would get the highest fraction here, and you would multiply that by the grant available. And by the grant available, I either mean for round two, DAC funding available 4.1, or general implementation, which is I think 12.6 million available. So this funding formula is important. And keep in the back of your mind if you're submitting through DAC implementation or general implementation, same formula, but different grant available, right? It would be nice if the formula was that simple, but there is the issue of once this calculation calculates, what happens if you get awarded more funding than you asked for? So that's where we take the difference between the funding you asked for, and if you ask for funding less than what you got awarded, we take that I call it leftover funding that you didn't ask for, but you got awarded through this first part of the formula, and we reallocate it till we get rid of it to the projects that still scored high, but asked for more funding. So that's kind of a confusing point. So I have a table here that lays out what happens, because you have weighted scores going on in that first part of the formula, but then you have this grant request, projects request in their application a certain amount of grant. So you can see what happens when you get, this is that first part of the fraction, your weighted score out of the total points available, or the total weighted score of all the highest projects. And for this example, there's 4 high scoring projects. So they all get a share of the total weighted score, so it's a percentage here. So we've got 2 projects where there's leftover grant. They got awarded more grant than they asked for. So instead of giving them grant that they may not need, or that they didn't ask for, we are recommending that we again use that same formula where we reallocate it to the other top projects, and you can see this project scored pretty high. This project scored low under this example, lower than the others. It's still a high scoring project, but it's got a lot higher grant requests. So it's going to get awarded further funding through the churning of this formula. So that's something important to highlight. These are still the high scoring projects though, as we determine through that participatory budgeting process though. Here's a separate scenario that could happen though. The grant request could be pretty high for the top scoring projects. You have the first part of the formula calculating, they've got their weighted scores going on, but then they get grant allocations happening that are all less than what they request. I mean, it could be maybe equal, but just through the power of math, that's kind of hard with everything going on in the formula. So through that, there's no caps, right? Under the previous scenario, these lower grant requests act as caps in a sense when there's further funding available through that first part of the formula. Through the second scenario, there's no caps really, because everyone requested grant funding. that turned out to be a larger value than the grant they were allocated under this formula. So it's hard to predict, I lay this out because it's kind of hard to predict, what other project proponents are going to request, how they're going to weight against your project. Are you going to be in the top scoring projects? How is your weight going to compare to the other top scoring projects, right? So it's important to really think about how much grant you're requesting, how strong your project is, that sort of thing. But we're proposing to use this formula because it's as objective as we can make it after we go through that first participatory budgeting process, highlighting the top scoring projects. But then to make the process further detailed here, we also, if you remember earlier on, how does the allocation process work for those other not competition pools, but for other pots of money? There's the pot of money for watershed wide and upper watershed. And in thinking about that, it's important to come back, okay, what does our agreement say with North Orange County IRWM Group? Because we need to live by that when doling out the amount of grant funding we allocate to these bodies. If you're a watershed wide project, what does that mean? It means you benefit both the upper and lower watersheds in the Santa Ana funding area. So you benefit both Riverside, San Bernardino, and Orange County. But if the selected projects that benefit both the upper and lower watersheds in Santa Fe area don't expend any portion of that 10% allocation, any unexpended funds would be allocated through a ratio approach. And these ratios are called out in the North Orange County IRWM agreement with SAPA. So what this means is, if selected projects, so if you don't have any high-ranking projects that meet this condition of benefiting upper and lower watershed, funding gets allocated to this in this formula, or these two ratios, 34 to 66. So 34% of the leftover funding would actually go to North Orange County. They have a separate process that they run for their slice of the pie. They have an OC plan that they've done with their stakeholders. So 34% of that leftover pot of money that was initially a pot of money for the upper watershed goes to North Orange County. 66% though would go to the other projects that are high scoring through this OWOW process. I think we have this in our agreement because in some ways it's hard to do a watershed-wide project. You have to benefit all three areas. So we have this contingency in here and kind of a ratio-based solution to do that. So it's automated and reduces negotiation conflict down the line with our North Orange County partners. What's also important to note is, upper watershed or watershed-wide projects can still be submitted, but they may not be high scoring. So if they're not high scoring, this agreement doesn't say they automatically get funded. They still need to score well under the process. So just if you have the only watershed-wide project and everything else is upper watershed only, that doesn't automatically reserve the funding for you. You have to still score well under the formula. The money isn't parked for you. So that's why it's not that's why this upper watershed and watershed wide is not a separate competition pool. It gets funded on the back end. I just covered a lot there. This is a lot to take in. I have a chat, so let me see what this question is. In terms of grant dollar award per project, do you foresee any issues with projects asking for 10 million in grant dollars, only getting offered 3 million? And now they don't have enough grant funds to move forward with their project. That is an issue. Yes, that is an issue. That can be. If they were counting on that funding, they and they can't complete the project with the amount of money that they were expecting to get or hoping to get, then yes, that would be a project. That would be an issue. And we deal with that by working with you in the participatory budgeting process. Because we want to catch that beforehand. Because if you can't do the project without the amount of grant funding you were hoping for, then you're probably not going to be able to execute the agreement. So we try and catch those things early on, but we don't always catch them. You're working with your board probably behind the scenes. You're working with maybe a partner, and those issues don't always work themselves out in the timeline we would like. So letting us know as early as possible if you can't complete the project, and being honest with that helps. But we know, it's hard for one person at your agency to do that. You got to get buy-in from your board, maybe another agency. So we know that process always takes a little time to work out. Got another question here. If the project will extend over lands of dozens of different property owners, do those property owners inherently need to be listed as partners, or would right of entry agreements need to be secured prior to the application process? Good question. I don't think you had to have right of entry agreements beforehand for your project for round one, but let me double check that. For round two, I'm not sure. So let me make a note. We are going to be developing a frequently asked questions document, and I'll add that to the list. Let me make a note of that. Any other questions? All right, seeing none. Get back to my presentation here. All right, so we talked about the scenarios with watershed-wide projects. Here's something to note how this works. This is a bit more maybe in the weeds than you really need, but how does that watershed-wide and upper watershed process work? Well, I show the dollar amounts here to kind of help picture it. So when we dole out money at watershed-wide or upper watershed through the general implementation pot, and we abide by that rule that I was mentioning, that we're really, OWOW is seeking to fund the top scoring projects first, i.e. we run the scoring formula first and then assess upper watershed versus watershed-wide funding. If those projects truly benefit, or if there are projects that claim watershed-wide, are they truly watershed-wide? And if they were high scoring or not. And then there's several scenarios that can happen after that. You can get 2 watershed-wide projects that score high, but request less than the watershed-wide funding available. And then there can be like maybe 2 or 3 watershed-wide projects that score high, but request more than the 2.6 million available. So I had some notes on that, what I think would happen under the scenario. Let me see if I can unhide that. Yeah, so under the first scenario, funding is allocated through that formula, that 33 to 66% ratio formula. There's money and cents left over. Under the second scenario, they may get funding, but it will be split out between the upper watershed and watershed-wide in the funding formula. So there, there's a number of scenarios that we just wanted to lay out that may happen when we get to the participatory budgeting process and talk about high versus low scoring projects and whether they truly are watershed-wide. All right, I think this is my last section of the presentation. I'll pause here, see if any folks have questions, but I just wanted to talk now about logistics of the OWOW Call for Projects and DWR grant application process. We talked a lot about like weights, formulas, how your project will measure up, but I thought it'd be important to talk about, okay, like how do you fill out a form? How do or what's it going to take to fill out this application? So, but before I get into logistics, let me pause there, see if folks have questions.
And this is Ray. So I just wanted, I think I had a quick comment more than a question.
Mm-hmm.
Nonprofits have traditionally had a really hard time with these IRWM, applications and projects. And I see several nonprofits on the, at least representative nonprofits on this. Do you have any comments on how nonprofits will be incentivized, integrated, assisted, or something with this process?
Yeah, if you don't mind explaining what, elaborate. It would be helpful to hear, from you and elaborate on kind of the hard times that it sounds like you've had hard times in the past. So what,
sure, and I think it's a perspective of hard times. So one thing is, we don't often have the capacity to attend a whole bunch of stakeholder meetings to, come up with, develop rankings and all that type of stuff. Coastkeeper generally does, but that's pretty uncommon. And then a lot of, the other thing is the match coming up with the matching funds. We can do things like, have, volunteers or something like that, but not all projects have that. So,
Yeah.
and then another thing that, was a component of another grant program was that, and I'm not suggesting that it's not part of the guidelines here, but it required that nonprofits be part of the project.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just looking for ways that, it can be, easier. Maybe there's extra points for partnering with a nonprofit, or if there's, so those are some of our experiences. And I don't know if other people want to mention theirs.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Ray. It's good to hear your thoughts on that. We appreciate that. Any other?
I want to be clear. I'm not complaining. We actually got selected for funding in one of the last IRWM rounds. Unfortunately, it didn't work out.
Right.
So it's not like we haven't been successful, but and I think everybody on this thing is going to agree that it's an arduous process.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you, Ray. Any other nonprofits or anybody else want to speak to that? I can speak to that as well as I can as well too. But I want to, as Ray mentioned, there might be other nonprofits that want to speak. Well, great. Well, thanks, Ray. Yeah, the first part of your comments, it sounded like you were talking about like process, right? And the upfront process to partner and attend these meetings, go through the application process. And we definitely understand that. We've tried to make it as easy as possible, but it is quite complicated because of the guidelines from DWR. And DWR is beholden to the Department of Finance that requires them to just uphold a lot of financial measures and checking the box types items. The IRWM community, we have a roundtable of regions group that brings up these issues strongly with DWR a lot. And they've told us they've tried to change things, and they're and it seems like they're really focusing their attention where they can make change, because some things they just can't change because the Department of Finance won't budge. But some things like the disadvantaged community funding, it seems like they can change. So that's why they're working on more guidance related to disadvantaged community projects. They added EDA, the economically distressed areas. They're trying to make it so you can use your own income survey information. That seems to be their solution to it. And that's kind of where we're going to, we're with these two competition pools, we're encouraging applicants, as you can see, that have single benefit, single jurisdiction, not necessarily an active partner, to apply through that pot of funding. We still want, the smaller scale projects, but, we're seeing what DWR is doing. They seem to have flexibility in disadvantaged community, and that's where we're making a change here. We're recommending a change here. So I don't mean to make excuses for like how cumbersome it is. I know your frustration. I feel it too sometimes, with just how complicated this process can get. But it's just the reality is the Department of Finance won't budge. There's just these state mandates that they're tied to. So hopefully that kind of helps with your question. I don't know. You have any follow-up on that, but be happy to hear it.
I just know we're early in the process, so I just wanted to bring those things up. And doesn't mean anything can be done about them, but I just wanted to highlight them from the nonprofit perspective. Yeah,
definitely. And we're really glad that your CEO is on the OWOW Steering Committee. That it's really important to have the nonprofit view on our governing body too. So we hope he brings these same comments up at the next meeting we have, or the meetings going forward, because yes, we welcome that input. So. Any other questions or comments regarding that, regarding process or ability to apply or work? I do see some comments in the chat box. Did I see correctly that awards are anticipated in April 2024? Yes. That's our best guess, though. That's based on when DWR will release their draft PSB, which is their guidelines document, and based off of past schedules. So that could change, but that's when we anticipate. That's our best guess. Next question, could you also post this PowerPoint on your website so it can be downloaded to take to management? Yes, so it'll be posted probably the next day or so. I'm going to also upload this recording to the website too, so that'll happen at the same time.
Ian, I have a quick question. This is Brian Dickinson with the City of Colton.
Yes.
Do projects have to be design or complete a design complete already? Or I'm in the process of doing a feasibility study for a small groundwater capture and recharge project.
Yeah, does your project need to be shovel ready essentially? Yeah, so we think, our educated guess is that you'll have to have your permits that you need ready for construction, any CEQA documents done 18 months after the agreement is executed. So 18 months after April 2024. That's our best guess though. So I would do the math there. I can't calculate 18 months after April 2024. But I would do the math there and see if you're ready for that. But once we get the guidelines from the state, I think we'll be able to share a better idea of that. That's just our educated guess based on what they've done in the past.
Oh, I should be plenty in time for that.
That's great to hear. Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, hearing none, there'll still be time to ask questions later, but I'm gonna move into some of the logistics like I mentioned, so you understand, just the effort it'll take to apply under this funding. So here we go. To highlight the schedule again, we're asking for your applications under the call for projects. We go through the rating, participatory budget, final ranked list, bring it to our governing body. And then once we know you're successful, we'll begin working with you to apply to eventually the Department of Water Resources. So what I'll be covering is really how the two applications drive together. You've got this lower level effort. It's still, considerable level of effort, call for projects. But then you'll have to add additional detail if you're successful to your application through the final DWR draft application, or through the final DWR application. So the call for projects is logistically, it's a web-based form. Currently, the first version of it is accessible at this web link. This too is where the presentations will be posted. So this web link is important. You might want to jot this down, or maybe I can paste it in the chat box. That's probably easier, so you don't have to take a screenshot. There, it's in that URL I just put in the chat box is where this the presentation will be posted, and the call for projects. And there's a link on this webpage that will take you to this this other website. It's like sapa.net/something. You don't have to remember that. Just remember this URL. Find the link to round 2 submission form. You'll create a login if you don't already have one from round 1, and you can continually come back to your project and keep editing it until your final submission, which a lot of people do towards the end of the close of the call for projects. There's some information that you can click on here, like instructions, submitted projects from OWOW round 1, some supporting documents and maps. I think there's a link to the DAC, DWR Disadvantaged Community Mapping Tool. That'll be updated once the round 2 PSP comes out. So I encourage you, if you have time, to familiarize yourself with the call for projects, but don't finalize your applications by any means. Finalize your benefit area in the DAC mapping tool that they have. They've told us that there'll be changes to that tool. There's going to be further guidance on DAC and EDA related items, but I just highlight this to kind of just get comfortable with the call for projects portal. And the call for projects is a form. It's through a portal, but it's a form that has a bunch of different fields in it. Here are some example fields that are important: project location, So description, and you'll have options to, if you're a DAC project, to map it through DWR's tool. What's important for running the scoring formula is you tell us what your benefits are, and we take those numeric benefits and run it through our formula, and we use Excel on the back end to do that. Project partners, talk about your partners and their roles, and then attachments, MOUs with project partners. So there's a section for attachments. So that's the call for projects process. Then later, if you're successful after the ranking, after the participatory budgeting, and if you're successful, we then go to the submission phase to DWR. So what you'll need to do that is you'll need to build off your call for projects application. We'll work with you to do that. We'll give you guidance. We usually hire a consultant to help SOP on that. But you provide a detailed scope at the task level, and there's 12 different tasks that DWR typically requires, like things down to construction management, permitting, planning. You'll need to provide your budget, and then you'll provide your schedule. So detailed budget at the task level and a detailed schedule at the task level. And then those more check the box items that are really required for, the Department of Finance at the end to meet their requirements are proving that you're an eligible applicant, showing that you got your urban water management compliance certificate from DWR. If you're an ag water management entity, showing that certificate. So, you've got to dig up documents on your end and submit them through SAPA that then we eventually submit it to DWR. All right, I'll pause there and see if folks have questions. That was the logistics there. I think this is the last segment. It's just next steps and other grant opportunities. So I'll pause there for a second, see if folks have questions. As DWR said when they were released the draft guidelines, they initially said August, but now it seems like they're unofficially saying September. So September unofficially. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat box, so I will move on. So next steps and other opportunities. So what are our next steps after this workshop? SAPA will take feedback from this meeting and share it with OWOW governance on September 23, 2021, such as the feedback we got from Ray, possibly hold another OWOW virtual workshop after this one. So there may be another opportunity for you all to participate, give feedback, but that's a possibility. DWR may release their draft PSP the first week of September, so we'll have to move pretty fast on that and start getting ready to kick off our call for projects. We'll take recommendations of any updates to the OWOW call for projects process to the OWOW governance on September 23 and September 4th. Those dates may be delayed if the draft PSP is not released in early September. Maybe it's released in late September or even October. So those dates will obviously have to move back. And then open the OWOW call for projects from October to January. And then January date may slip too. I didn't highlight it in the slide. But if DWR changes a lot of things in their round 2 criteria from round 1, if we get more feedback from stakeholders, if we get additional new feedback from our governing body, we'll push back the call for projects. And then, as I highlighted in my opening slide, it's important to note there's other opportunities, state grant opportunities related to the drought, related to dry conditions, related to providing more water to urban and rural communities across the state. The state experienced a tax windfall after the close of the fiscal year this summer. So there's general fund money, not bond funding, but general fund money that'll be coming out from DWR and the State Water Board. So there'll be small communities money that'll be awarded through the DWR Water Use Efficiency Branch. That'll come out through a PSP that hasn't been released yet, but that'll be coming out, and we'll highlight that as appropriate going forward. There'll be something called multi-benefit money that'll be coming out from DWR. Their IRWM branch will be the lead for that. So it may kind of have a similar ring to this Prop 1 Round 2 money. We'll see, and we'll assess how we as SAPA, working with our member agencies and the stakeholders, want to how they want to deal with that money. Urban communities money, that's money that will likely be rolled out with the multi-benefit money, because DWR's IRWM branch will also be the lead for that. We don't know yet what that urban communities money will look like. It may really be focused on disadvantaged community projects. We don't know yet, but that is something that DWR, I think, is exploring. So if you were involved in our disadvantaged community involvement program that Rick Wetzel led at SAPA, you may be interested in that money. We'll let you know about it. But even if you're interested in applying for the DAC implementation portion of the funding, you may be interested in that money. So once we get that PSP and learn more details, we'll make sure we talk about these other pots of money as they relate to our process. There's also, if you're involved in Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, you probably know that there's going to be some general fund money for to help what are they called? Groundwater sustainability agencies implement SGMA, or the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But note at this time, funding is for counties. This general fund money is for counties included in the state drought declaration. So currently, none of our 3 counties in this watershed or this funding area are in that type of scenario. They haven't been declared state drought. Or there's a other process. The county has gone through a state water board, which is a separate agency, not DWR, go through a drought scenario process. That drought scenario process, which is kind of the off-ramp to getting declared by the governor is under a drought declaration, hasn't really yet been defined. It's kind of like a process that doesn't exist yet. But there seems to be some type of what the legislature seems to be working on streamlining the process, or allowing Southern California counties who aren't in the drought to apply. So that's all changing. That's working itself out in the legislature. So I don't have a ton of detail about these pots of money, what they intend, but I just wanted to highlight them as we may be talking about them further in these type of meetings and how they relate to this bond funding we've been talking about. So I think that's my last, second to the last slide. This is our contact information. My manager is Mark Norton. He also leads the OWOW process. He's one of your contacts, and also myself. My name's Ian, I guess I should say, as I mentioned earlier. So that's my contact information. And there's our URL that we pasted in the chat box. So that is the end of my presentation. And we are happy to talk in depth on anything the group wants to talk about. What I'm showing here that I thought, if the group is interested, we could talk more about the weights and the categories we have, because as we're recommending, we're got 2 different competition pools, general and DAC, right? And we also have 2 different sets of categories, or 2 sets of categories. They're similar, but the DAC category, of course, doesn't have a couple. And then the weights are changing slightly from the first round. So I will leave it here. We covered this earlier, but I'll leave this on the screen, and I'll just pause and see if the group has any questions or wants to discuss anything further. All right, don't see anything in the chat box at the moment, but maybe people are typing. I'll just wait here. As you're waiting, I encourage you to look at the weights from the first round and the weights in the second round. Think about which competition pool you would compete in, whether you like that process, whether you have any thoughts on it, both positive or negative, the percentage extra credit categories, any other percentage categories you'd want to see. Ray alluded to a nonprofit percentage category. Any other thoughts you have? Maybe a benefit class that's missing. a weight you don't like, a weight you want to see changed, anything at all. Happy to talk about it. Love to get your thoughts on this. All right, well, I don't see any more chats in the chat box. If you have additional thoughts and you want to share with them, if they come to you later, or if you'd prefer to share them via email, our contact information is here. I'll paste it in the chat box too. I can do that. All right, well, I don't see any chats in the chat box. I pasted my email address in there. So I will go ahead and wind down the meeting here. So like I mentioned, next stop is possible another workshop. We'll release a frequently asked questions document to get at Aaron's question, as well as probably a couple other questions. We'll post that on that same URL webpage. We'll possibly hold another workshop. And we're waiting to receive DWR's draft PSP, see how much it changes, and that'll inform whether the call for projects gets pushed back. And we'll go from there. So if there's no further questions, everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at hopefully a future meeting. Take care, everyone.